Welcome to Unregistered Live, the official live stream of Unregistered Academy. Go to unregisteredacademy.com to check out our school, our courses, our discussions, our debates, our courses, as I said, on many topics: philosophy, geopolitics, U.S. history. Go to unregisteredacademy.com. It's in the link in the description, or the link is in the description for the Academy as a whole, and you should join. You can take our courses as a member. You can have access to all the courses at the Academy if you're a monthly member or an annual member. It's quite a deal. And tonight I will be presenting portions of two courses, one on fascism and one on the New Deal. So take a look at the description. In the description, the link for I think the fascism course is there. And I'll be presenting actually some of that course here and actually a little bit of brand new material that no one has seen before. So let's talk about what's in the news. And what's in the news in the last few weeks has been fascism. And I'm not making a claim about whether actual fascism is going on, but that word has been used a lot. There's been many, many discussions about whether what the Trump administration has been doing is fascist, whether Trump himself is fascist, whether the MAGA movement is fascist. It's been almost dominating, right? The headlines, the news over the last several weeks. My position on that is that there are certain elements of Trump's program and his policies and his rhetoric that I would say are consistent with fascist policies and discourse from Italy and Germany in the early 20th century, but there is also quite a bit that is not consistent with fascist politics. It is also very early in the Trump administration to determine much, I think. I think we don't have enough data yet. There's some data for sure, but not enough to make a determination. But what I want to do tonight is talk about the history of fascism in the United States of America. And it is not going to be a lecture on the tiny number of members of the American Nazi Party, because they were about as big as a softball team. I'm not going to talk about the neo-Nazis who show up by the fives or sixes or dozens at a couple rallies. Yes, they're actual fascists, I suppose, but they are insignificant. The people who showed up at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, those Nazis, those neo-Nazis, we're not talking about them. They have never held any institutional power whatsoever in this country. They've never held any discursive power. They've not been allowed into, even still today, even with the internet, they're still not allowed into respectable discursive avenues. They're effectively banned from society and have been for close to a century now. So I'm not talking about people who have explicitly identified as fascists or Nazis. There have been a few in American history, but very few. And as I said, they have held zero institutional power. Now, so what we will be talking about is what I believe and some other scholars believe is the first emergence of an identifiably fascist movement that did have institutional power, and that would be the New Deal under the Franklin Roosevelt administration between 1933 and 1945. That administration, that government, in many, many ways, as I say in my book, A Renegade History of the United States, there's a chapter on this. But in the course, there is material that you won't find in that book. But as I say in that chapter and in the course, it seems undeniable to me, and I'll show you just some of the evidence here tonight, absolutely undeniable that the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which was the politics of the Democratic Party and still defines the politics of much of the Democratic Party, was at least a close sibling of Italian and German fascism. Now, many people, particular people who are fond of Roosevelt, and there are many, he is consistently voted by historians and journalists as one of the top 5 presidents in American history. He is routinely idolized, I would say, within the Democratic Party, and there is often a call to bring back the New Deal, not just the Green New Deal, which is a big talking point among Democrats, but the whole New Deal. There's a lot of nostalgia for the New Deal and all of its politics among Democrats to this day. Well, so let's look at what some undeniable fascists had to say about the New Deal and about Franklin Roosevelt. So Adolf Hitler came to power in January of 1933, and Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as president in March of 1933. 4 months later, after Roosevelt had been inaugurated, and he did much in those months, launched what we now call the first New Deal slate of programs. Adolf Hitler said this about Franklin Roosevelt. He said, "I have sympathy for Mr. Roosevelt because he marches straight toward his objectives over Congress, lobbies, and bureaucracy. I am the only leader in Europe who understands the methods and motives of President Roosevelt." What was one of the very first things that Roosevelt did as an executive order? He closed all the banks in the country, calling a bank holiday. He did that unilaterally without consulting Congress. And that's one of the ways in which he was dictatorial, and that's one of the ways in which Hitler admired him. There's more, though. This is a year later. This is actually a letter that Hitler wrote to Roosevelt himself. A direct letter he wrote to the White House in March of 1934. Hitler said, "The Reich Chancellor congratulates President Roosevelt upon his historic effort in the interest of the American people. The president's successful struggle against economic distress is being followed by the entire German people with interest and admiration. The Reich Chancellor is in accord with the president that the virtues of sense of duty, readiness for sacrifice, and discipline must be the supreme rule of the whole nation. This moral demand, which the president is addressing to every single citizen, is also the quintessence of German philosophy of the state, expressed in its motto, the public weal before private gain." My goodness. Hitler was not shy about his praise for Roosevelt and the New Deal as a whole. This is not just for Roosevelt. This is the whole New Deal Democratic Party program that he's praising here. But yes, there's still more. The Volkischer Beobachter was the official newspaper of the Gestapo in Germany. And this is what they had to say over a couple years about Roosevelt and the New Deal. He said, this is the Gestapo's official newspaper. "We too, as German National Socialists, are looking toward America. Roosevelt is carrying out experiments and they are bold. We too fear only the possibility that they might fail. If not always in the same words, Roosevelt too demands that collective good be put before individual self-interest. Many passages in his book, Looking Forward, could have been written by a National Socialist. In any case, one can assume that he feels considerable affinity with the National Socialist philosophy." Roosevelt puts forward the fictional appearance of democracy, but in the United States, the development toward an authoritarian state is underway. Roosevelt is adopting National Socialist strains of thought in his economic and social policies. That's the newspaper of the Gestapo of the Third Reich in 1934 and 1935. Those are the second and third years of the Roosevelt presidency. But there's more. There's, of course, this man, Benito Mussolini, basically the founder of fascism, and still rightly considered the chief intellectual founder of fascism. He said this about Roosevelt. He said, "The appeal to the decisiveness and masculine sobriety of the nation's youth, with which Roosevelt here calls his readers to battle, is reminiscent of the ways and means by which fascism awakened the Italian people. Behold a dictator." He, of course, that's a positive statement. Behold Roosevelt the dictator, the great man. So let's look at some of the nitty gritty. There's a lot more in the course about the many, many overlaps between the New Deal and European fascism. But I'd say the central part of it is the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was passed very early in Roosevelt's first term, June of 1933. It's central legislation, or it is the central legislation of what we call, as I said earlier, the first New Deal. The first 2 years, 2.5 years of the Roosevelt administration is what we call the first New Deal. It created the National Recovery Administration, known as the NRA, and the logo for the NRA is on the right there. To do this, they suspended, also as part of this legislation, they suspended all federal antitrust laws because the government was about to establish monopolies in every major industry. So the government created cartels, which they called code authorities of businesses in every major industry. These code authorities, these were committees made up of government officials and business officials and some labor officials, but mostly it was government and business officials meeting together to determine prices of products, wages for workers, and production quotas, what will be made and what will not be made, and how much of it and where it will be shipped. All those major fundamental decisions in each industry was determined by a committee called a code authority, made up of government officials from Washington, D.C., and representatives of major businesses in those industries. So these were called this was exactly the same system, which we call corporatism, essentially the same system, economic system, in fascist Italy and in Nazi Germany. In fascist Italy, their committees that managed each industry were called corporatives. In Nazi Germany, they were called industrial cartels. In all three countries in the 1930s, those cartels, those corporatist cartels that determined the very shape of every major industry, could be overruled only by the head of state. So Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and Roosevelt in the United States were the only people who could overturn the rulings of those corporatist cartels. So there have been multiple scholars who have written about this. This is the most clear and extensive similarity or overlap between the New Deal and European fascists. So again, let's look at some aesthetics here. So here's the logo of the National Recovery Administration. Just take a long look at it, actually. Just take a second here. Study it. And let me show you another logo. That's the Reichschancellery eagle, of course, one of the main symbols of the Nazi Party and the Third Reich. And here is the flag of the National Fascist Party of Italy. This is Mussolini's party. This is the original fascist party. So I am not the first to note some similarities here. Interesting. Interesting. So there's that, but there's more. The thinking among many of the New Dealers in the Roosevelt administration was explicitly pro-fascist. So this guy right here, Rexford Tugwell, he was one of Roosevelt's chief central advisors, that group of men who advised Roosevelt on his major policies were known as the Brains Trust. Tugwell was an original member of the Brains Trust, and as I said, advised Roosevelt on all of the major initiatives of the New Deal. And they, in many cases, and this is just one example, in the course I show you multiple examples of members of the Roosevelt administration who said very favorable things about fascism. So Tugwell, who was the Undersecretary of Agriculture formally, but as I said, informally, was one of the major advisors for the New Deal. He says this: during World War I, we were on the verge of having an international industrial machine. Only the armistice prevented a great experiment in control of production, control of price, and control of consumption. So very, very keen on government control of industry and the economy. Our pluralistic system, laissez-faire in industry, checks and balances in government, and so on, must be shaped into a unity if its inherent conflicts, beginning to be so serious, were not to destroy us. The Germans had the key to that unity in philosophy, in economics, and perhaps in politics. I saw the conflict now so ominously coming up over the horizon as one between the living wholeness of the German conception and the dying divisiveness of English pluralism. When industry is government and government is industry, this is a very pure expression of corporatism. When industry is government and government is industry, a merger of state and the economy, is industry, the dual conflict deep in our modern institutions will have been abated. So he's calling for this. But there's more. Here is what he says about fascism itself. He says, Mussolini certainly has the same people opposed to him as FDR has. But he has the press controlled so they cannot scream lies at him daily. And he has a compact and disciplined nation, although it lacks resources. On the surface, at least, he seems to have made enormous progress. Italian fascism is the cleanest, neatest, most efficiently operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious. This was the architect of many key pieces of New Deal legislation. This was one of the top 3 advisors to the President of the United States. So let's look at some other, again, there's many, many more examples we cover in the course on the various similarities between the New Deal and fascist regimes. Right here, let's look at some of the propaganda posters that were put out in Germany and the United States by the national governments in the 1930s. So on the left there, this is it's a program, as a poster of the program. On the left will always be the New Deal posters. On the right will be from Nazi Germany. So on the left is a poster promoting the New York City branch of the United States Housing Authority, which was one of the principal New Deal programs. And on the right was the counterpart in Germany at the time. Hitler, too, had a major public works program that built a lot of low-income housing for Aryan German citizens. And they promoted it in very similar ways as the New Deal government promoted theirs here. Similar, here we are again, the U.S. Housing Authority promoted on the left, and the counterpart, the Nazi German public housing program, is promoted on the right. On the left is the Works Progress Administration, one of the major New Deal agencies that employed people by the federal government, employed millions of people to build things, to provide services, etc. And one of them, it did a lot of funding of public health, medical workers, etc. were employed by the federal government under the New Deal. So this on the left is a poster promoting that program. And on the right is, again, a similar program in Nazi Germany. promoting motherhood through state intervention. Valorization of work is a major theme in both governments. On the left, a WPA poster, Works Progress Administration. Again, this was a public works project or agency that employed millions of workers through the 1930s and 1940s, building major infrastructure in the United States, and did a lot of promotion with lots of posters like this. And again, a similar thing happened in Nazi Germany. There were major public works programs, major social welfare programs that were very, very similar in their structure to the New Deal programs. And so here's another similar promotion. Work and food on the right, and on the left, another WPA poster, again, sort of valorizing or celebrating labor, and especially masculine labor. On the left is a New Deal poster. On the right is a Nazi German poster. Men working with their hands. On the left is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was Roosevelt's favorite New Deal program. It employed millions of young men in building trails and roads and developing the national parks. Similarly, Hitler was very keen on conservation too, and also built national parks and did a lot of land reclamation projects and celebrated it as the virtuous labor of Germany's young men. So that's the CCC in the United States on the left, and that's the work service, the Nazi labor service, or the German labor service on the right. It has been said that there was quite a bit of homoeroticism in Nazi propaganda. I think that's quite clear, but there's also quite a bit of it in New Deal propaganda as well. Right? The celebration of masculine strength and discipline and fortitude. Similarly, work pays America. Lots of hammers, lots of muscular arms in the propaganda in both countries. As I said, lots of hammers. Okay, I think is that it? Oh, here we go. Now the final thing I'm going to present. This is a special thing. This is not in the book. This is only in the course. These are Thomas Hines and John Reps here are two of the top architectural historians. These are two of the top experts on architecture in the United States. And this is what they had to say about the architecture. And a lot of buildings were commissioned by Roosevelt. Much of Washington, D.C., when you go to the mall in Washington, D.C., much of what you see was built by the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. And this is what these two architectural historians say about all that New Deal architecture that is all over Washington, D.C., and actually much of America, too. He says, Hines says, however left of center Roosevelt may have been on other fronts, his architectural tastes were grandly conservative, not far removed from those of his contemporaries, the dictators of Italy and Germany. John Repp says, it was a supreme irony the plain forms of originally conceived to magnify the glories of despotic kings and emperors came to be applied as a national symbol of a country whose philosophical basis was so firmly rooted in democratic equality. What are they talking about? How many of you watching have been to the mall in Washington, D.C.? How many of you have seen, the major government buildings there? What you were looking at, it turns out, was quite similar to the architecture of the Third Reich. On the left, the U.S. Supreme Court building, which was completed in 1935, again, during the Roosevelt administration. On the right is the New Reich Chancellery, the major government building of the Nazi Party. Here's the National Art Gallery on the left, and on the right, the House of German Art, both completed in 1937. The Jefferson Memorial, completed in 1943, a Roosevelt project on the right. These were temples to Nazi martyrs that were built in 1935 and then demolished after the war. The U.S. National Archives on the left, built in 1937. On the right, detail of the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin in 1938. And finally, on the left, the U.S. Postmaster General Building, completed in the Federal Triangle in 1934. And on the right, the Germania House of Tourism in Berlin, designed by Albert Speer, the major Nazi architect, in 1942. So that's just a little taste of the many, many similarities and overlaps between the New Deal government of the United States and New Deal politics and the politics and policies of Italian fascism and German Nazism. To get more, take the course. Go to the fascism course at Unregistered Academy. The link is in the description. Take a look at all of our courses, join up, and I hope to see you in class. Thank you.